In the depths of his private case files, Carl Jung documented a psychological phenomenon so disturbing that he hesitated to publish his findings during his lifetime. What he discovered challenged everything the psychological community believed about human nature, empathy, and the delicate balance between compassion and power. Jung called it among the most challenging transformations he had ever witnessed, and across decades of practice at his Zurich clinic. He observed the same terrifying pattern repeating itself with surgical precision. The question that haunted Jung for years was simple yet profound. What happens when the kindest people finally reach their breaking point? Jung's case files reveal a disturbing truth that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. The patients who walked through his doors were unjust victims of abuse. They were individuals, carrying capabilities so advanced that society had systematically taught them to suppress their own psychological gifts. These were empaths, but not in the way most people understand the term. Jung discovered that these individuals possessed what he termed psychological genius in hiding, abilities so sophisticated that they terrified even seasoned mental health professionals. The pattern always began the same way. Patient after patient arrived at Jung's clinic carrying identical wounds, though they came from vastly different backgrounds and circumstances. They were the emotional shock absorbers of their social systems, individuals who had spent their entire lives serving as repositories for collective psychological pain. They carried their family's dysfunction, their spouse's rage, their children's trauma, and their community's unspoken darkness. They arrived with bruises they explained away, depression they blamed entirely on themselves, and a universal tendency to apologize for their very existence. But Jung noticed something that set these patients apart from typical abuse victims. When he asked them to describe their relationships and experiences, he expected to hear the scattered, fragmented thoughts characteristic of trauma. Instead, what emerged from these sessions fundamentally changed Jung's understanding of empathic psychology. These patients hadn't simply endured abuse, they had been systematically studying it. Every slight, every manipulation, every moment of cruelty had been cataloged with scientific precision. Jung discovered that these empaths maintained detailed mental records of every person who had ever hurt them. They knew their abusers' triggers with surgical accuracy, understood their insecurities at a cellular level, and had mapped their emotional patterns with the precision of a military strategist. What made this discovery so chilling was that these empaths had never once used this knowledge defensively. It simply observed, absorbed, and filed away information while continuing to offer unconditional love and support to those who harmed them. The empath's mind, Jung realized, operated not as a victim-esque diary, but as what he privately termed a strategist's war room, waiting for the moment of activation. These individuals were unprocessing their experiences as random acts of cruelty they were unconsciously building. Psychological profiles of unprecedented accuracy and depth. They could predict behavior, anticipate emotional reactions, and understand motivations with a clarity that surpassed Jung's own decades of training. Jung began testing their abilities in controlled settings, bringing colleagues and acquaintances into sessions without providing any background information. Within minutes, these patients could identify childhood traumas, relationship patterns, professional insecurities, and hidden fears with an accuracy rate that consistently exceeded 95%. They weren't psychic, they were simply paying attention at a level most humans never reach. What others dismissed as intuition, they recognized as sophisticated data collection and pattern recognition. This revelation forced Jung to confront an uncomfortable truth about empathic individuals. Society had taught these psychologically gifted people that their abilities were a curse rather than a blessing. Every time they tried to voice what they saw, the lies, the manipulation, the hidden agendas, people labeled them as too sensitive or overly emotional. They learned to silence themselves, to doubt their perceptions, and to apologize for seeing what others couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. But the truth, Jung observed, doesn't disappear simply because someone stops speaking it. It accumulates. And in these cases, it had been accumulating for decades, creating a psychological pressure that would eventually demand release. Jung realized that these empaths were on losing their minds from feeling too much. They were losing their minds from being told their feelings were wrong. Their psychological distress wasn't the result of oversensitivity, but of being forced to deny the accuracy of their perceptions. They weren't having nervous breakdowns. They were having breakthroughs that society was too threatened to recognize. The devastating element was not the act of betrayal itself. Fit was the empath. A sudden realization that they had seen the signs all along and had chosen to ignore them. In case after case, Jung documented the same scenario unfolding. The empath would discover infidelity, financial betrayal, or emotional manipulation from their closest person. Initially, they responded exactly as they always had. They said nothing, absorbed the pain in silence, blamed themselves for not being enough, and tried even harder to be the perfect partner, child, or friend. They increased their efforts to heal, fix, and save the person who had wounded them. Then came what Jung termed the clarity event, the moment when the empath, as pattern recognition finally overwhelmed their desperate need to believe the best in people. This wasn't a gradual awakening, but a sudden, complete shift in psychological perspective. Jung observed that this transformation embodied his concepts about psychological awakening under extreme circumstances, representing the moment when someone finally integrates their analytical capabilities with their emotional intelligence. Most people, Jung noted, would expect empaths to respond to such betrayal with emotional chaos crying, screaming, falling apart in dramatic fashion. Their abusers certainly expected that response and had prepared themselves to handle hysterical outbursts. What actually happened was something that terrified everyone involved, including Jung himself. The empaths became unnaturally calm. This wasn't the calm of emotional numbness or dissociation that Jung had observed in other trauma cases. This was the calm of someone who had finally stopped fighting against their own perceptions and had begun to trust their psychological gifts completely. Jung documented this as the moment when someone finally integrates their suppressed intelligence with their emotional awareness, creating what he privately called psychological completion. What followed was the most chilling transformation Jung had ever witnessed in his decades of practice. These empaths didn't attack their betrayers with rage or cruelty. They didn't seek revenge in any traditional sense. Instead, they simply began to speak truth with clinical precision. They revealed everything they had observed, cataloged, and silently endured over years or even decades of relationship. But this wasn't truth-telling driven by emotion. It was truth delivered with surgical accuracy. Like skilled diagnosticians identifying each diseased aspect of a system before systematically removing it. These awakened empaths laid out their observations with devastating clarity. They didn't speak with malice or cruelty, but with the detached precision of scientists presenting research findings. Jung realized that this wasn't revenge in any conventional sense. This was shadow integration. The moment when someone stops denying the parts of themselves they were taught to suppress and finally embraces their complete psychological capabilities. The empath's shadow wasn't evil or destructive. It was their suppressed intelligence, their silenced intuition, their denied strength. When they finally integrated these aspects of themselves, they became what Jung called psychologically complete. The most disturbing aspect of these transformations, from Jung's perspective, was their permanence. These patients didn't cycle back into people-pleasing behaviors. They didn't apologize for their newfound boundaries or second-guess their perceptions. They'd become what Jung secretly feared most, empaths, who could no longer be manipulated, gaslit, or emotionally exploited. The changes extended far beyond the psychological realm. Jung documented how these individuals' entire lives transformed within months of their awakening. They left abusive relationships with strategic precision, cutting contact with toxic family members without emotional drama or lengthy explanations. They rebuilt their social circles, their careers, and their living situations according to their own terms and values. Jung observed them becoming what he termed selectively empathetic, still deeply caring and capable of profound connection, but strategically protective of where that care flowed. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery was how these transformed empaths' presence affected others around them. People who had once walked all over them suddenly felt nervous and uncomfortable in their company. They couldn't explain why these empaths weren't aggressive, cruel, or overtly threatening. But everyone sensed that something fundamental had changed. Jung identified what he called the predator S instinct, the way manipulative. People could sense when their usual tactics wouldn't work, avoiding integrated empaths like vampires avoid sunlight. Jung's fascination with these cases went beyond professional interest. He was personally disturbed. because he recognized something familiar in their transformation, something that mirrored his own psychological development. Jung himself was what we would now call a highly sensitive person. He understood the empath's journey from the inside, knew the pain of seeing what others couldn't see and feeling what others wouldn't acknowledge. These cases forced him to confront a profoundly unsettling question. What happens when empaths stop being society's emotional shock absorbers and start using their gifts strategically? Part 2. The Awakened Empath. Jung spent years following these transformed patients in their post-integration lives, and what he discovered kept him awake at night. These individuals had become extraordinarily successful in ways that went far beyond conventional measures of achievement. Their businesses thrived because they could read clients' real needs before those needs were even fully formed. Their new relationships were healthy and authentic because they could identify emotional predators within minutes of meeting them. Their decision-making was flawless because they had learned to trust their intuitive intelligence completely. But Jung realized something that made his blood run cold. These empaths had become less empathetic through their transformation. They had become perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They understood human psychology at a level that made them nearly omnipotent in social situations. They could manipulate others as easily as they had once been manipulated, influence outcomes with subtle precision, and navigate complex human systems with supernatural accuracy. What truly terrified Jung was not what these transformed empaths could do, but what they chose not to do. They possessed the psychological tools to destroy every person who had ever hurt them, to manipulate their way into any position of power, to exact revenge with surgical precision. Instead, they simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved forward with their own development. Jung realized he had witnessed the birth of what he called the integrated empath, someone with both the sensitivity to feel everything and the wisdom to choose what deserved their energy. Jung's private notes reveal his amazement at this discovery. I have observed something beautiful and terrible. These individuals have become what every manipulator fears most. Someone who can see through them completely but no longer needs anything from them. This psychological independence, Jung understood, was what made awakened empaths so powerful. They could engage with others from a position of complete emotional sovereignty, offering connection without desperation and love without attachment to outcome. These empath transformations didn't happen in isolation. They created ripple effects throughout entire social systems. Jung documented how their changes forced evolution in everyone around them. Family dynamics that had been built on dysfunctional patterns for generations suddenly collapsed. Not because these individuals destroyed them, but because they stopped enabling the dysfunction. Alcoholic family members were forced to face their addictions without empaths, serving as emotional dumping grounds. Depressed relatives had to find other sources of validation and support. Manipulative siblings could no longer use these transformed empaths as psychological punching bags. Jung observed something he termed the empath's mirror effect. These transformed individuals didn't have to actively confront people's dysfunction anymore. Their mere presence reflected issues back with uncomfortable clarity. Manipulators couldn't stand to be around them because they felt exposed, seen through, unable to operate their usual psychological games. Meanwhile, authentic people felt safer with these empaths than they had ever felt with anyone else. The most disturbing discovery came when Jung introduced these transformed patients to others in his practice. Within minutes, they could identify core psychological wounds and recommend the exact type of therapeutic intervention needed. Their diagnostic accuracy surpassed Jung's own decades of training, creating an ethical dilemma that haunted him for years. If empaths could naturally develop this level of psychological insight, what did that mean for the future of psychology itself? Jung began developing what he privately called the Integration Observation Protocol, a framework for understanding how this transformation occurs naturally. He was not providing therapy in any traditional sense, but rather documenting how empaths spontaneously developed what he termed warrior consciousness after severe betrayal. Jung identified consistent stages across his cases, representing a crucial phase in the evolution from unconscious empathy to conscious psychological mastery. The first stage was recognition empaths learning to identify their suppressed shadow aspects. This wasn't just about acknowledging their anger, but about embracing their intelligence, their strength, and their fundamental right to boundaries. These individuals stopped pathologizing their perceptions and began trusting their emotional intelligence as the sophisticated data processing system it actually was. The second stage proved more intense: integration. Jung watched empaths merge their light and shadow aspects into what he called the complete self. They became people who could be incredibly kind to those who deserved it, and ruthlessly precise with those who did. This was unteeved about becoming cruel. It was about developing the ability to respond appropriately to different types of people and situations. The third stage, application, was what Jung found most fascinating. Integrated empaths learned to use their emotional intelligence strategically, not just defensively. They became what Jung described as psychological architects, people who could read, influence, and navigate human systems with supernatural precision. These empaths could no longer be victimized because they saw manipulation coming from miles away and neutralized it before it could take root. Jung's research revealed that these transformed empaths didn't just heal themselves, they became immune to psychological abuse while maintaining their capacity for genuine love and connection. His private notes reflect his amazement. "I have observed the development of compassion paired with wisdom. These individuals are now among the most psychologically powerful people I have ever encountered." The process's final stage was what Jung understood as the natural return to service. Integrated empaths didn't become cold or disconnected from humanity. Instead, they became selectively generous with their gifts, using their abilities to help other empaths transform and creating what Jung documented as a network of psychologically resilient individuals. They became teachers, healers, and guides for others, making the same journey from unconscious absorption to conscious choice. Jung's work with these empath cases created ripple effects that continue influencing psychology today. He began seeing empathic sensitivity not as a disorder to be cured, but as a psychological capability to be properly understood and protected. He recognized that empaths weren't mentally ill. They were evolutionarily advanced, individuals living in systems designed to exploit their gifts. However, Jung also recognized something concerning. In the wrong circumstances, these abilities could be devastating. An empath who integrated their shadow without proper ethical grounding could become extremely manipulative and psychologically dangerous. Jung developed what he called the ethical integration model, documenting how awakened empaths naturally use their powers for healing rather than harm. But he remained concerned about the potential for these abilities to be weaponized. His case files on these transformations remained among his most closely guarded research. He knew that if the wrong people learned how to deliberately trigger empath transformation or manipulate the process, it could be used for destructive purposes. Jung scattered his observations across multiple private journals, never publishing the complete findings during his lifetime. Jung's final notes on these cases reveal something profoundly beautiful. These individuals lived the rest of their lives as what he described as balanced warriors, people capable of incredible gentleness with those who earned it and implacable strength against those who threatened it. They became templates for what Jung believed was humanity's next evolutionary step. People who could feel everything without being destroyed by it, see everything without becoming cynical, and love deeply without losing themselves. Modern research confirms what Jung's cases demonstrated decades ago. Empaths who undergo conscious shadow integration become psychologically invincible in the truest sense. They can no longer be gaslit because they trust their perceptions absolutely. They can't be manipulated because they see emotional games before they're fully formed. They can't be broken because they've already been to the bottom and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than before. Jung's research revealed something that manipulators do and want empaths to know. The transformation Jung documented did unhappen gradually. It occurred in explosive moments that reflected what he understood about shadow integration under extreme psychological duress. The trigger was always betrayal, but not just any betrayal. It had to be betrayal by someone the empath had completely trusted and protected. Someone for whom they had sacrificed their own well-being repeatedly.